what happened when you put on a demonstration to support the nurses? Obviously, because they were only being offered 1% by the government. What happened when you put that demonstration on?
My union branch just got lots and lots of members and sort of health workers generally. It's not just nurses, it's all the health workers who were furious about the year that we've had and the fact that we started the pandemic with such a terrible health service that's been affected by austerity in the last 10 years, has lost 17,000 beds, had 100,000 vacancies, and was in a dire state dealing with the health we had before the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, there was no spare capacity whatsoever, and has left both patients and staff in a really awful position. And we're in a position where, you know, as Britain, we are bottom of the league for the number of deaths per head of population. We have the highest number of deaths per head of population, and that unless they do something about the health service and make a serious commitment, and that includes a serious commitment to health workers who work in it, that situation isn't going to change. And people were worried about that and felt that the 1% was contemptuous. So we agreed to hold a protest. We held the protest. It was risk assessed. It was socially distanced. We had markers on the ground, little cones as to where people could stand 2.5 metres apart. Everyone would be asked to wear masks. It was stewarded. It wasn't a march, it was a static protest. So it was very safe, using all the current up-to-date risk assessments. We're health workers, we don't want to hurt anybody. And on the day, they explained to us that that you're not allowed, it's unlawful under the COVID regulations, and therefore they didn't want us to go ahead. They weren't interested really in any safety mechanisms and mitigations that we put in. They weren't interested in whether it was safe. They just kept repeating that it was unlawful. We had some discussion about that. And in the end, when they said, you know, you will be fined and you will be reported to your employer and to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, I spoke to people and shut the protest down. When everybody had gone and we'd done the media interviews and everything, they then took me to one side and told me that they were fining me £10,000 for organising a protest that had more than 30 people on it under the COVID regulations. And I have to say, I was absolutely gobsmacked.
Wow. And that's still, you're still expecting to receive that fine?
It's a fixed penalty notice. It's not a criminal offence. It's like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. It's a fixed penalty notice. It's not a criminal offence. But it is a huge amount of money, and you receive it in the post like you do any of those. I'm still waiting to receive it. And since I was given that fixed penalty notice, or told I would be receiving it, we've had massive support in terms of sort of people who I've never met before in my life, have set up crowdfunding pages, and we've raised more than the £10,000 that we needed within a couple of hours of doing so, which I think is a reflection. Somebody said they gave to it because they absolutely didn't want the government to think that this was something that they supported. They were horrified by the fact that that we'd been given, for a safe protest of health workers, we've been given a fine in breach of COVID regulations. So we fundraised, but also Andy Burnham, who's the mayor for Greater Manchester, has said that he will he's asked the police to review whether or not the fine was appropriate and whether it was proportionate to the risk that we posed and to the actions that we took. So, I mean, we will see whether in reality I do receive it. If I do receive it, I will be challenging it legally and I will be taking it forward. And I just think there's something wrong in a world where it's very clear from a government point of view that they are using the COVID restrictions to clamp down on opposition to what they do, despite the fact that more and more people are dying all the time, that the impact on the economy that ordinary working class people are paying the price for, the impact on health disproportionately impacting on poor people, on black people, on old people, on disabled people, that's something that goes on, and that they don't have a strategy strategy, or the strategy that they have isn't one that works, and yet they want us to not be able to oppose it and call for it to change. And I think that on last weekend, when you saw what they did to the women in Clapham who were trying to grieve somebody who died, but also argue that, you know, that they wanted an end, rightly, we want an end to violence against women, that, you know, a woman who's been killed by a serving police officer, that same police force can then use violence to break up that vigil of women, is just outrageous. And I think we have to say that there is something wrong with the society that we live in that doesn't allow health workers in Manchester to protest, or women in Clapham to express their grief and demand an end to the ongoing violence to which there appears to be no end against women.
Just one more question. What do you think is the importance of protest? I mean, if the government's legislation goes through today, how would that affect you? Would you keep protesting even though the government would put this regulation in that you can't, the police can stop a protest without much notice or without any real explanation?
I think large fines and threats of 10 years prison are an attempt to stop people protesting. There is no doubt, even if my fine is overturned in a court, it will have had an effect, and we already know it has, of people calling off protests. And you just look at the Black Lives Matter protest. Would racism be as high as it is on the agenda and the fight against racism if there hadn't been the huge protests in response to the death of George Floyd? You know, would we have still been paying the poll tax if there hadn't been huge demonstrations against the poll tax, to use a very old example? Would we have an awareness of climate change and of the threat that is sort of, you know, that is hanging over all our lives and our future without the protests of Extinction Rebellion and others? You know, and I think that the government are running the economy for profit, and they don't want people to oppose it. And the aim of their legislation and the fines against me and the fines and the breakup of the vigil in Clapham are all about trying to stop resistance to those attacks. And I think it's vital that we defend the right to protest. It's a basic human right, and it's one that you might sacrifice if it is extremely dangerous for you to do so in circumstances. But the government are not doing it because it's extremely dangerous to do so. There is lots and lots of evidence that it is virtually impossible to transmit COVID outdoors. It's indoors that's a threat, and the only outdoors events that have been associated with transmission have had an indoor element to them as well, and that's why they've included a significant amount of transmission. And I do think a fine for a health worker of £10,000, somebody calculated for me that it would take me 56 years to pay it if I used my 1% pay rise that the government have offered me. If Dominic Cummings had had a fine, which he didn't, but if he'd had one of £10,000, then it would have taken him 3 months of his pay rise for last year. And I just think that's the difference between ordinary people and the rich, is that they can afford to shrug off fines, they can afford to bob to court and pay barristers. Ordinary working class people don't have that. All we have is our collective strength, and that's what they want to take away from us. And I think it's an absolute disgrace, and we need to resist, and we need to continue to protest, and I will continue to protest.